stop scrolling, because this is not just about one ban, one company, or one country. This is about power, fear, and the quiet war happening behind every tech ban you read in the news. The question isn't just why the USA keeps banning Indian companies. The real question is, what are they so afraid of? You think it's about data, about security? Let me tell you something that's going to make you uncomfortable. It's not. It's about control. It's about gatekeeping. And it's about the one thing no one wants to admit. India is rising, and the old guard doesn't know how to handle it. So if you're someone building, dreaming, or just trying to understand the game behind the scenes, you better stick around. Because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly why these bans are happening and why they're not stopping anytime soon. When the United States announces a ban on a foreign company, especially one from India, the headlines always scream the same phrase: national security concern. It sounds serious. It sounds justified. But scratch the surface, and you'll find that what's being labeled a security risk often has less to do with cybersecurity and a lot more to do with economic protectionism and fear of disruption. Let's break that down. 1. The national security label, a convenient cover. The term national security is powerful. It triggers instant emotional agreement. Who would argue against protecting a nation's safety? But in the last decade, it's become a strategic label that governments, especially the US, use to halt foreign competition, especially when that competition is coming from emerging economies like India. For example, let's say an Indian tech startup creates a low-cost, high-performance software platform that begins to challenge established American companies. That startup isn't just competition, it's a threat to market dominance. By branding it a security issue, the US government can stop its operations, freeze its access, and cut its oxygen supply to Western markets, all without discussing the real reason: money, market share, and influence. 2. Economic disruption as a threat. Indian companies are getting smarter, faster, and more innovative. They are no longer seen as just cheap labor or outsourcing partners. They are product creators, market leaders, and soon, potential category kings in industries like AI, fintech, pharmaceuticals, and green tech. This kind of success is disruptive. It challenges pricing models, pushes American companies to adapt, and shifts global investment patterns. Take the pharmaceutical industry as an example. Indian generics have been under scrutiny for quality concerns, yet in many cases these claims come right after Indian firms undercut US drug prices by 70–80%. Coincidence? Maybe. Pattern? Definitely. 3. Fear of losing control over global standards. For decades, the US has been the benchmark setter for everything, from software to intellectual property laws to technology ethics. But now, Indian firms are introducing new standards, new methods, and new business models that aren't rooted in the Silicon Valley playbook, and that's unsettling. If Indian tech giants start leading in areas like AI safety, drone tech, or digital payments infrastructure, the US risks losing its intellectual leadership, and that's not just a pride issue, it's a geopolitical one. 4. The rise of digital borders. We are entering an age where data is more powerful than oil. Countries no longer just protect physical borders. They protect digital ones too. Indian apps like Ku, Paytm, and others started gaining traction in international markets. But suddenly, regulatory red tape, arbitrary app store removals, and denial of market access started creeping in. Under the guise of security, what's really happening is the construction of digital walls to keep economic power from shifting. 5. The pattern is global, but it hits India differently. Let's be clear, China has experienced this too, but India is unique. It's a democratic ally, a massive market, and a critical player in the Indo-Pacific region. So when the US bans Indian firms, it can't say they're authoritarian or we don't share values. Instead, it leans harder into vague, unverifiable claims that make it nearly impossible for Indian companies to fight back or defend their position in Western courts or public opinion. 6. What's the real threat? The real threat isn't that Indian companies are dangerous. The threat is that they're dangerously competitive. They offer world-class quality at a lower price. They innovate at speed, and they no longer need validation from Silicon Valley to succeed. So when we ask, why does the USA keep banning Indian companies? We have to stop accepting surface-level answers, because underneath the words national security lies a very different reality: the fear of losing economic power. There was a time when Indian companies were known primarily for outsourcing back-end support and low-cost services. That time is over. Today, India is producing unicorns, setting global standards in fintech and clean energy. And this massive transformation is sending shockwaves through Western markets, particularly the United States. Because for the first time in modern history, India isn't just catching up, it's threatening to lead. And that, quite frankly, is alarming to a global order that's long depended on a clear hierarchy. The West innovates, the East executes. Let's unpack what's really going on. 1. From back office to brain hub. Indian startups and tech giants are no longer the support team for American companies. They're building platforms, products, and ecosystems that rival, sometimes outperform, their Western counterparts. For example, Zoho has quietly built one of the most powerful all-in-one SaaS platforms completely bootstrapped and at a fraction of the cost of Salesforce. Udaan and Razorpay have changed how Indian consumers and businesses interact with finance, bringing in models that Western fintech companies now look to replicate. ISRO, India's space agency, is launching satellites at a fraction of NASA's cost, prompting even global companies to look at India for commercial space partnerships. This isn't incremental growth, it's paradigm shifting. 2. Cost disruption is market disruption. Let's talk numbers. Indian tech firms don't just innovate, they do it at scale and lower cost. That's a lethal combination. Where a Silicon Valley startup might need $50 million, 0 cents in VC funding to build a scalable product, an Indian counterpart might do it with $5 million, 0 cents, and reach more users doing it. And that's terrifying for Western competitors who are used to dominating not just through quality, but through pricing power. Imagine a world where Indian software or AI tools start dominating because they cost 70% less and work just as well. That's not a foreign trade issue, that's a Wall Street nightmare. 3, population power meets digital infrastructure. India isn't just big in terms of population, it's now digitally unified. The Aadhaar system, UPI, Unified Payments Interface, and the Digital India Initiative have created an ecosystem where 1 billion people can transact, verify, and interact online in seconds. That's not just national infrastructure. That's a blueprint for the future. And guess who's watching? Everyone, from Silicon Valley CEOs to Washington policymakers. When Indian firms start exporting that tech model, licensing it, or using it to dominate emerging markets, it becomes a direct challenge to the US's influence on global digital frameworks and deep tech. The new battlefront, India, is no longer just a follower in frontier technologies. Its AI research institutions, defense tech startups, and semiconductor ambitions are gaining global traction. Combine that with a large English-speaking tech workforce, government-backed initiatives, and VC money pouring in, and what do you get? A new tech superpower. And unlike China, India's democratic structure makes it harder to justify extreme bans or isolation. So instead, regulatory chokeholds, selective scrutiny, and yes, strategic bans. 5. Western monopoly fears are real. Every time an Indian company grows big enough to pose a challenge, there's a sudden spike in attention, often negative. Security concerns, data handling worries, compliance issues. But if you compare these accusations with what's tolerated from Western giants like Meta, Amazon, or the double standard becomes obvious. What's happening isn't neutral. It's economic defense in the name of regulation. 6. This isn't just about business. It's about power. At its core, the West's reaction to India's tech rise isn't just about apps or platforms. It's about the fear of losing control. Control over ideas, money, markets, and influence. And the rise of Indian companies threatens to decentralize that power. So when the US bans or sidelines Indian firms, it's not just protecting users, it's protecting the old guard of global dominance. Because India's message is clear. We're not just here to compete. We're here to lead. We like to believe that business is a meritocracy, that if your product is good, your tech is secure, your team is efficient, you'll win. But in today's world, performance isn't enough. If your company is from the wrong country at the wrong time, it won't matter how brilliant your innovation is, because global markets aren't just shaped by competition, they're controlled by geopolitics. And that's exactly what Indian companies are running into. Every time an Indian firm starts climbing too fast, making too much noise, or getting too close to global dominance, it suddenly finds itself caught in a net of political friction, trade tensions, and regulatory firestorms, mostly from the United States. Let's unpack how and why politics overpowers performance when Indian businesses threaten the global status quo. 1. Business success isn't apolitical anymore. Gone are the days when a company could stay neutral. In today's landscape, what country your headquarters is in can determine your access, your image, and your future. For Indian companies, this creates a complex paradox. On one hand, India is hailed as a strategic ally of the US, a democratic counterweight to China, a critical player in the Indo-Pacific. On the other hand, Indian firms, especially in tech, defense, data, and digital infrastructure, are being watched, restricted, or even banned when they grow too fast. The contradiction? India is a friend, until its companies become competitive threats. 2, the US trade playbook, reward allies, punish rivals. Selectively international trade isn't fair. It's strategic. The US doesn't just trade based on business merit. It trades to maintain influence. Indian companies that align with American goals are often welcomed. But when they outperform US firms, undercut prices, or scale too fast, Washington starts reaching for the regulatory red button. We've seen this in defense tech, pharmaceuticals, mobile apps, and even social platforms. Companies like Bharat Biotech faced approval delays during COVID. Apps like Coup and platforms like Paytm have faced scrutiny despite showing strong growth. Ask yourself, if these same companies were born in Berlin or Boston, would the reception be the same? Probably not. 3. Geopolitical tensions spill into boardrooms every international summit. Border conflict or diplomatic flare-up has real consequences for Indian companies trying to expand globally. When US-India relations are smooth, business flows easily. When there's friction, say over Russia-India ties, oil trade, or India asserting autonomy on global issues, Indian companies suddenly face new obstacles. These bans aren't always official. Sometimes they're slowdowns, visa restrictions, cloud hosting issues, arbitrary compliance hurdles. That's how politics quietly crushes performance. 4, the performance paradox. Excel too much, and you're a threat. If an Indian company is just good, it's ignored. If it's great, it's tolerated. But if it's exceptional, meaning it can go global, attract US clients, beat US pricing, and gain user trust, it becomes a problem. That's when the scrutiny kicks in. Is your data safe? Do you comply with our vague, ever-changing regulations? Who funds you? These questions aren't always about safety. They're about slowing momentum, giving US companies time to catch up, copy, or compete. 5. Selective protectionism disguised as global standards. The US often claims to uphold open markets and free trade, but in practice, it protects its turf. This protectionism is cloaked in the language of compliance and ethics, but it disproportionately impacts companies from rising nations, especially, ironically, while US tech giants continue to operate in India despite facing data breaches, monopolistic behavior, and privacy scandals, Indian companies rarely get the same tolerance in the US. Why? Because the game isn't fair. It's rigged around political comfort zones. 6. When politics enters the boardroom, merit takes the back seat. Indian companies are learning a tough truth. You can do everything right and still lose access. Not because your product isn't good, but because you were born on the wrong side of global politics. Because your success makes someone in Washington nervous. Because your growth doesn't align with their strategy. And this is the new battlefield. It's not about who codes the fastest. It's about who fits into the story the global powers want to tell. When a company is banned, restricted, or heavily scrutinized by the United States, there's usually a familiar phrase attached to it: failure to meet data privacy standards. Or sometimes it's national security concerns. Other times, non-compliance with regulatory frameworks. Sounds legitimate, right? But here's the problem. Not all companies are held to the same standards. What we're seeing is selective scrutiny, where Indian companies are judged with a magnifying glass, while Western firms get a blind eye, even when they're guilty of far more serious violations. Let's explore how these double standards work and why they exist. One rule book for the West, another for the rest. Let's start with a few examples. Facebook, now Meta, has faced multiple global scandals, from the Cambridge Analytica data leak to misinformation issues and mass privacy violations. Amazon has been probed repeatedly for anti-competitive practices, tax evasion, and worker exploitation. Yet these companies still operate freely in the US and across much of the world. Now contrast that with what happens to Indian platforms. Indian fintech apps face bans or app store takedowns over ambiguous data privacy violations. Indian pharmaceutical companies are blacklisted over minor compliance lapses, even when American firms have been involved in major opioid crises. Indian social media or communication apps are removed from US platforms with little transparency or right to appeal. The difference? Origin. If you're from Silicon Valley, your mistakes are business errors. If you're from Bengaluru or Hyderabad, your entire legitimacy is questioned. 2. Regulation as a weapon, not a standard regulation, is supposed to protect consumers. But increasingly, it's being used as a weapon of economic defense. When a non-Western company gains market share too quickly, American regulators and lawmakers suddenly discover concerns. And these concerns, ironically, only seem to appear when the company begins to compete on US turf. If an Indian company is only successful inside India, it's largely ignored. But the moment it enters Western markets or becomes globally visible, regulatory scrutiny ramps up. It's not about safety, it's about slowing foreign competition. 3. The undefined threat strategy. Notice how the US often bans or restricts Indian firms using vague, undefined language. Could pose a risk, potentially violates our norms, inconsistent with our data expectations. These aren't measurable violations. They're preemptive justifications. There's no clear evidence, no trial, no accountability, just a narrative. And the vagueness is the point. It allows policymakers to block what they fear without having to prove anything concrete. 4. The burden of proof is always heavier for Indian companies. Here's something Indian CEOs know all too well. They have to be perfect to even be considered. Every line of code, every user policy, every privacy agreement has to be bulletproof, because one mistake means disqualification. Meanwhile, American firms can face billion-dollar lawsuits and still operate with business as usual. This unbalanced system puts Indian firms at a constant disadvantage. They're fighting with less access, higher compliance barriers, and zero forgiveness. 5. Why are Indian companies singled out? It's not just because they're foreign, it's because they're presumed secure until proven otherwise. Non-Western platforms, especially Indian and Chinese, are presumed unsafe until proven otherwise. This is not based on actual data security practices or ethics. It's based on prejudiced assumptions. Indian apps, even when they follow international protocols, are still required to prove they aren't spying, stealing, or cutting corners just because they're Indian. Meanwhile, major privacy violations from Western firms are labeled as missteps, not structural flaws. 6. Cultural bias isn't just unfair, it's expensive. When global regulators, investors, and consumers operate under biased assumptions, it costs innovation, it slows down funding, it blocks market access, it discourages talented founders from even trying. Cultural bias doesn't just hurt Indian companies, it hurts the global economy by delaying the rise of new, better ideas. And that's the tragedy. While Indian companies are innovating for the future, they're being judged by the past. This isn't a call for special treatment, it's a demand for equal footing. Let Indian companies rise or fall based on performance, not on where they were born, what language they speak, or how their founders sound in an elevator pitch. Because the next big tech revolution won't have an accent, it'll have impact. Let's be real about one thing. National security is the most powerful excuse in the world. It's the shield that shuts down debate, the label that justifies anything, and the ultimate trump card in international business. And lately, it's being played far too often and far too strategically when it comes to Indian company. We're told that these bans and restrictions are about keeping citizens safe, protecting data, and defending democratic values. But let's strip away the political language and call it what it really is: economic nationalism in disguise. 1. Security concerns or market competition. When a country like the US blocks or restricts an Indian firm, it almost never says it's doing it for economic reasons. That would be too transparent. Instead, it invokes national security, a term broad enough to include anything from data storage concerns to vague geopolitical risks. But let's look at the pattern. These concerns only arise when the Indian company is scaling aggressively or competing directly with American businesses. If the company is small, niche, or irrelevant to US interests, nobody seems to care about its threat level. In other words, success triggers scrutiny, not safety, failures. 2. The blanket accusation. It might be dangerous. Here's how the game works. A successful Indian company enters a global market. It gains users, traction, maybe even press. Suddenly, US lawmakers or regulators raise red flags. We don't know how this company handles data. We can't be sure it's free from foreign influence. We need to investigate before giving it access to our infrastructure. There's no actual evidence, just fear. And fear sells. That's all it takes to stop growth in its tracks. And the public never questions it because the phrase national security shuts down the conversation. 3. Tech sovereignty is the new economic war front. For decades, economic power came from oil, land, and manufacturing. Today, it comes from data, infrastructure, and platform control. The US knows this, so does every major economy. So when an Indian company threatens to control a slice of this digital pie, it's not seen as business, it's seen as strategic encroachment. And the fastest way to block that? Say it's a security threat. You don't have to compete if you can ban the competitor. 4. What happens when the tables turn? Imagine if India started banning US companies simply for being dominant in the Indian market. Imagine if it said, we can't allow Google because it might influence public discourse. We'll restrict Microsoft because we can't verify its military ties. Let's block Amazon because it's hoarding